What's going on, everybody, and welcome to a not really an episode of the book binge, but also not a Wheel of Time diary because I'm not covering the Wheel of Time today, but it is a reading diary. This time on, like I said, not Wheel of Time book. This one is on At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. I hope that's how it's pronounced. I apologize if that's not how it's pronounced, but if it's not, that's how I'm going to pronounce it for the rest of this video if I ever say his name again. So either way, the purpose of today's video is kind of twofold. One of them is to be able to have a spoiler discussion on the book in general, but one of them is also to attempt to put forth my ideas and my interpretation of what I think happened, particularly with the ending and kind of what the book is about. Part of the reason why I'm doing this is just because there's not really that, well, there's plenty of reviews of the book on YouTube, but there don't seem to be that many videos that are like dedicated or focused on specifically trying to decipher what the ending means or what the book is about in general. And to be fair, I didn't watch very many of those reviews that I saw, but most of them don't really go into the topic as deeply as I want them to. And in my own review that I'm going to do of this book, which I'm going to record right after this, actually, I don't want to go into that either. I just want it to be a spoiler-free discussion and just my analysis of the book the same way that I review basically every other book on the channel. But I knew that this one kind of warranted and deserved having its sort of own spoiler talk. And so instead of doing a diary on the road by Cormac McCarthy like I originally intended for today, I'm doing it on this instead. By the way, I will be referring to At Night All Blood is Black for the majority of this video as Annabib instead of the actual title, because saying the full title a million times would get annoying and is a little bit, it gets me tongue-tied a little bit. I don't know why, but it does. So I will be referring to it as Annabib for pretty much the duration of this video. With that being said, let's go ahead and do a brief little spoiler-free what is Annabib about. And this isn't really, spoilerish what I'm about to say, because it's somewhat what's on the back cover. So Annabib is a book about a soldier on the fields in World War I who witnesses the death of a friend who he treats or views as sort of a brother, and follows this soldier as he goes places, let's say, both along a present timeline, various points of a past timeline, and on a sort of mental subtextual timeline as well. The wonder of this book and the reason I am doing the diary on it, like I said, is because there is so much subtext to it. There's so many layers of metaphor. The last few chapters especially make the book kind of impossible to really read without some attempt at an analysis. Kind of forced to try to understand what you read because of the last 3 to 5 chapters. So that's the goal of this video, is essentially to try to decipher some of that. Undoubtedly, this is going to be not the best video. It's probably going to be a little bit rambly at times, and would be far better if I actually spent a few weeks researching a little bit more, trying to find other people's takes and whatever takes exist, and taking those other theories into account, and then actually doing a full reread of the book. But I don't have the time for that at the moment, especially not for the schedule that places this video at when it's going to be released. So I'm not going to do that, and if I was, it would be more like a full script anyway, and not some ramble focused video like this. And kind of what I'm getting at is, if I really wanted to do this book justice, I would take a totally different approach to the video, which I'm not doing for today. But even so, the notes that I have for this are 1,500 words. I have 1,500 words in this document for it, whereas most of my video review notes or anything like that are only like 3, 5, maybe 700 words max, and that's just like points to talk about. Part of that is because some of the stuff that I've written in here is actually written as the bullet points would be if I were to do an actual script for it. So if this seems like it's kind of going in between, or if I seem like I'm looking at the screen over here and like reading off of it, it's because I sort of am. If I try to go off of all of this and all of the points that I made trying to go off the top of my head, it's going to be even more messy. So I'm not going to do that. But here we are. Let me try to explain, at least some of the meaning of Annabib with spoilers here. So that's your warning. If you haven't read this book yet, This video is not for you. You best wait until whenever I do my spoiler-free review. But if you have read it, and especially if you were here because you had questions about it, you can stick around because I'm going into spoilers now. So what do we essentially know about At Night All Blood is Black? Well, the first half of Anabib can essentially be put into a World War I primarily setting. It's basically what it is, and it is very well structured and intentionally so, I believe. The narrator, the first person narration, sort of it's not really stream of conscious, but there are some points where it feels stream of consciousness. The narrator Alpha and his best friend, his more than brother, as he says at multiple points in the story, Mademba, I hope I'm pronouncing these names correctly again, are fighting on the front lines of trench warfare in World War I. The book essentially starts with Alpha recounting Mademba's death and the guilt he feels for not killing Mademba when this more than brother begged Alpha to kill him instead of, just letting him die in pain. Instead of having him suffer, he wanted to be killed by his brother. Because he was disemboweled on the battlefield, essentially. So he was in agony while he was dying. The book from this point essentially continues between passages of the past and the present. This is what I mean and what I'm referencing when I say that it's structured very well, and I think very intentionally, because Alpha will flash back and forth between exploits on the battlefield, so kind of pushing a little bit forward into the present, the present future timeline, and then moments from before Mademba's death. So once or twice are from immediately preceding what we'd seen before. So the book starts off with Mademba already dying, or actually with Mademba already dead, and Alpha is simply saying that he regrets not killing him when he was begged to do so. And the next time he goes into the past, it's immediately preceding this, with Mademba still alive and actively begging for Alpha to do it, and Alpha running through his mind, no, I don't want to do this. Why would I kill my brother? And then the next time it flashes back to the past is just before this, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, he shifts a little bit to brief snippets before the war in this first half of the book to reference the pair's more than brotherhood, as he puts it, and what that meant to Alpha. So sort of the relationship between Alpha and Mademba. Each flashback to the past is steadily further in the past, kind of as I suggested, just immediately preceding. But on the other end, it also moves a little bit further and further into the future with the present timeline as the book continues as well. You're going a little bit further into, his exploits on the battlefield. Like I said, you go into with it one night and sort of his cohort's reactions to his doings on the battlefield, and then goes back into the past, and then so on and so forth. Kind of like I said, it goes back and forth. These flash forwards after the flashbacks basically outline Alpha's exploits as a form of personal vengeance for what happened to Mademba. As I mentioned, Mademba was disemboweled on the battlefield by a bayonet from an enemy soldier who is pretending to be dead, so Alpha's exploits primarily target him going into the trenches of the enemy and playing dead just to take any of the enemy that crosses over him when they're alone, and basically taking them away and then disemboweling them in the same way and proceeding to cut off their hand as well and taking the hand back as a sort of trophy to his own trench. And for the first few nights, this is actually celebrated by his cohort as him being really brave. And then eventually this kind of gets creepy. And in this back and forth narration style, Alpha also explains that he had another person in the trench who was kind of like a friend, and the only person who really backed him and supported him when he was kind of doing these sort of brutal, eviscerations of the enemy and bringing back their hands. So there's a lot of thematic stuff here, but he talks about this other friend, and once that friend died, then basically everybody kind of rejected Alpha. They didn't want to be near him, they didn't really want to talk to him, they thought he was a demon, essentially. So these are kind of what's going on in the first half of the book, and it is also a little bit more understandable in a thematic sense. There's obviously the themes, the ideas relating to war, there's vengeance and mercy with, Alpha's exploits on the battlefield going and eviscerating the enemy. So there's that aspect to it. There's the ideas of psychotic breakdowns in witnessing evil, or what witnessing such a, traumatic event in witnessing a brother die essentially could do to a person mentally. There's a little bit of that started, a little bit of an inkling of that idea in the book in this first half. Giving in to the evil that you have witnessed, there's this idea as well. And then, of course, the eventual loss of humanity from committing inhuman deeds. And this is a little bit more of, instead of an internal thematic aspect with Alpha's character, it's this specific one, losing humanity, comes as well from his cohort. As I said, his buddies, his fellow soldiers, kind of start to view him as a demon, as somebody who is not to be messed with. The reason why people don't want to associate with him or don't even really want to touch him or look at him is because they fear that they could catch this sort of demon aspect, I suppose. But there is a lot of this going on. There's also some aspect of unreliable narration, I think, in this first half of the book. But I guess sort of Anabib as a whole, there's this aspect to it. I don't think it's necessarily a huge aspect. I think it's just a little bit of it, because I do feel like as I was reading, there were some details that seemed to be slightly different or changed slightly as they were brought up. So I think there's a little bit of that idea as on top of everything else that I think could play a part in an analysis of the book if I were to script one. The second half of Anabib sees a fairly substantial shift in the setting and the structure of the story, and also in the themes of it. But we'll get to that in a little bit, because there's actually a decent bit to talk about here, more or less in how the book actually goes forward. So joining this sort of psychotic break that I briefly mentioned as being the idea that is introduced in the first half of the book, Alpha is essentially put on a medical leave of sorts by his higher ups. He says they basically tell him, like, look, you've been doing good killing the enemy, but you're also seem to be getting a little bit too into doing this brutal stuff. So we're going to put you on medical leave and bring you back next month when you've maybe had a little bit of time to recover from this sort of sickness, and so that you're maybe not quite so crazy and creepy and weird and distasteful to the rest of the group in this, soldiery. The back half of Anabib spends time in an asylum setting as such when he is put on this sort of medical leave, with a few extra characters. There's a doctor and a nurse and a therapy location where Alpha is encouraged to draw whatever he wants, presumably to allow the therapy workers to get a gauge on where he is mentally. This is probably some sort of, system that they've developed during wartime to be able to help people who are suffering mentally from the deeds of war. This section of the book also spends a lot more time in the deeper past of Alpha's life, and additionally the structure as such is much less consistent as predictable. As I mentioned, the first half of the book goes back and forth a little bit, going a little bit further into the future with the present timeline, a little bit further into the past with each flashback, essentially. Like that's more or less what the first half of the book is doing. The second half is not quite that way. There are a few very specific moments in which Alpha is taken back to specific parts of his past, but for the most part, these flashbacks aren't consistent in any form of structural sense, as I've discussed. Rather than a form of back and forth that goes further into the past and then further in the present each time, Alpha simply muses on several aspects of his past based off of what he's doing in this sort of therapy. This is primarily where this has happened. He spends plenty of time in the book ruminating on an aspect of his past with a lady called Fary Thiam, relating her at many points, especially in this therapy setting, with the nurse Mademoiselle Francois. Then comes the therapy art session. So like that's an important point, is like he's relating this lady from his past whom he lost his virginity with and relates her to the nurse. And this is something that kind of ties in a little bit at the end. But with the therapy sessions, first, Alpha, basically, like I mentioned, the soldiers are encouraged to draw whatever they want. And I'm guessing this is meant to gauge what is going on in their mind at the time that they are doing the drawing, so that therapists or the doctors can kind of have an idea of what they need to do to try to get somebody back on the right path, or help a healing process for soldiers. But this is wartime, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. But with that being said, there are 3 sessions of these that Alpha describes. First off, he draws a picture of his mother's face, and this is accompanied with flashbacks to Alpha's young childhood when his mother leaves to find her father, and there's a little bit of history associated with this in the story, but his mother never returns, and that's the point of this flashback, is that his mother leaves, never returns, and turns his father essentially into an old man because she never returns. From the moment she left, his father became a more decrepit person, and every year that she didn't return, he seemed to get older and older. Second session of these, Alpha draws a picture of Mademba's face, and I believe he mentioned that it was the face as it was before the war, or at least early on in the war, or in some sort of aspect where, you know, obviously it's not the dead face. These are accompanied with flashbacks of Mademba inviting Alpha into his home and essentially adopting him as a brother, and the family adopting him as a son following Alpha's mother's disappearance. So he's not just a friend, he is a brother, a more than brother, as the story puts him. There's a lot of symbolism, especially in this section, with Alpha and Mademba being essentially opposites within their physicality, things such as their physicality and their fitness, their size, their brains, stuff like this. So Alpha is depicted as being this large wrestler type of figure who is very strong and able to do a lot of physical things. He's very fit, whereas Mademba is a little bit more of a brainiac. He goes to school, he learns stuff that Alpha isn't able to know, and then also some of it comes to how they're built as well. Mademba is described as being very small and frail, and not really capable of doing stuff, to the point that when he tries to apply for the army, they reject him because he's too small, so Alpha has to train him and basically make him more fit for duty, essentially. And Alpha is described as being this wrestler figure, like I said, who's big, large, and very strong. So there's a lot of there's a lot of thematic and subtextual meaning to this dichotomy here, and I assume there's probably a lot of meaning to the stories with Alpha's mother as well. Not entirely sure how that all fits in, not to mention the fact that I don't remember all of that super well, so that's why I more or less glazed over that a little bit more. But moving on to the third art session, Alpha draws a picture of the 7 severed hands he severed from his respective slaughters on the battlefield in the first half of the book. So actually, and this is part of where the unreliable narration aspect comes in a little bit, because I feel like every time it was mentioned, there was either like 5 hands or there were 6 hands, and then there was 7, and then it was just back to 6, and now it's 7 again. I couldn't exactly put a finger on how many exactly hands there were, let alone how many hands he actually had, because one of the hands was lost with another friend who was using it as like a sort of a bait for the enemy to kill him, essentially. But you know, that's all stuff to discuss with the first half of the book as well. But it's described in the second half of the book as being a drawing of the 7 severed hands, which truly calls his sanity into question. Obviously, it is depicted that the Dr. Francois, sees the pictures of his mother's face and sees the picture of Mademba's face and sort of respects these images, likes these images. They look good and they signify good things, you know, sort of memory and, you know, wanting to relate to that kind of stuff. But the third image is a little bit more disconcerting, obviously, because someone's drawing 7 severed hands, especially when they're drawn in the way that they were treated, as he basically treated those 7 hands to preserve them. But either way, seeing the disappointment in Dr. Francois' eyes, the story takes a big cut here, a big shift in direction, and it leads into the last 5 chapters, which are definitely something, and in ways very hard to understand and put together. As a result, the last few chapters see this dramatic shift in the subtext, kind of like I said. There's more of the thematic underpinnings of the book in the beginning of the second half that are, you know, continuing and calling on the same ideas from the first half, but the very end of the book starts to do something very different in this regard. The sensibilities and the thematic material, there's some other stuff to discuss. Also, minor trigger warning here for this section. If you've read the book, you surely understand why and presumably could handle it. I'm not going to mention anything in detail. and I'm not going to mention the word of what happens because I'm not allowed to say the word on YouTube. But there is a scene, I believe it's the 5th chapter from the end, where Alpha basically forces himself upon the nurse, Mademoiselle Francois, again with all of this relating back to the woman who he lost his virginity with, as, you know, the day before leaving for the war with Mary Thiam. There's this comparison that is drawn between these two characters a lot. There's also some other aspects to Alpha's and Mademba's character that are also called into this dichotomy. I already mentioned things like physicality, but there was also the aspect of Mademba having died a boy because he had not lost his virginity yet, whereas Alpha was a man because he had lost his virginity before coming to the war. This was an idea that was depicted in the book, and there's the ideas of the dissociation of self and other stuff like this, because these last few chapters get really confusing because it essentially suggests that Mademba and Alpha are the same person, the same character, or at least that Mademba has invaded Alpha's personality or psyche in some way, shape, or form. There's a chapter, I believe it's the 2nd chapter from the end, it might be the 3rd chapter from the end, I'm not entirely sure, where this character is kind of seen from an outside perspective, a third-person perspective, in an interrogation from other people, presumably other people in the army or in the asylum or wherever it is, where Alpha says, I am life and death, I am double, and it goes with the monologue of this whole thing of opposites, essentially. There's the idea of essentially split personality disorder here. Like I said, also relating to the dissociation of self. Alpha snapping, seeing disappointment from the hands, and eventually just, you know, becoming Mademba in some sense. There's also the metaphorical aspect of the book with myth and fairy tale in the last chapter of the book. There is, you know, the metaphor, the literal fairy tale that is told, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And then there's also the possession by Mademba, just as I mentioned, split personality disorder, this kind of stuff, calling everything into question. I know a lot of what I just said probably doesn't make too much sense, and I probably just sounded like I'm a crazy person at the moment, but that was essentially that's kind of what we know, and part of that was me going into speculation at the end. Again, this would be structured better if I scripted it, but that's fine. Let's get into a little bit of my personal theory and kind of explanation for what this kind of means, what this ending means, what this ending suggests for the rest of the book. There are many different ways to interpret Anabib, mostly due to the ending. Just as I've mentioned before, some of these interpretations can be a bit more literal, while many others are a bit more figurative. I'm going to posit a sort of combination of the two, as I don't believe Diop, the author, intended for it to go solely one way or the other, but I am going to lean a little bit more heavily on one end of that spectrum. As I mentioned before, there is a lot of metaphor intrinsic here to the design of the novel. A lot of this comes in the form of the myth told in the final chapter. It makes up the bulk of the more figurative interpretation of the story as well, where you're calling these characters into relating them with this sort of myth and fairy tale that is told. There are parallels to be drawn between Alpha and Mademba and their relationship throughout the story, but also within the fairy tale, both in forms of the opposites and in them being brothers as well, including pieces about Alpha's crest, his family crest as a young boy being of a lion, and the myth being in part about a lion sorcerer. So there are things to draw parallels to between this. There's also relevance to similarities between the princess of the story and either or, in some sense both, the nurse Mademoiselle Francois and of Mary Thiam, but again, a lot of this is representative of the more figurative interpretation of the story, and I'm sure there's a lot of this that is important to the interpretation of the book, but I tend to go a little bit more literal. I do think there are things to be said for these figurative bits of symbolism, but like I said, I fall a little bit more on the literal side of interpretations. I'm not entirely sure why, but this is how I am inclined to see it. A piece of Alpha broke, seeing his more than brother die by evisceration. So at the very beginning of the book, something in Alpha's character broke because of this, and quite frankly, that's a very traumatic thing. It's kind of fair for that to be the case. Furthermore, the guilt for not putting Mademba out of his misery when asked thrice, begged even, only accentuated this sort of fracture of Alpha's self. Alpha essentially takes revenge by inflicting the same sort of heinous death on more than half a dozen of the enemy, and in doing so, fully loses his own humanity, essentially his soul. And this is related in the fact that many of his fellow soldiers refer to him as sort of a demon. Alpha is then put into medical care, where he is reminded of and recounts stories of his childhood, and instead of humanizing him again and connecting him back to the modern world, it accentuates the dichotomy between Alpha and Mademba. In some sense, my understanding is that Alpha splits just with a dissociative identity, whatever, and becomes Mademba while still being Alpha. In the interrogation, as I mentioned before, Alpha mentions being double, being life and death, representing the living Alpha and the dead Mademba in the same sort of physical body, amongst countless other opposites in metaphor, just as I mentioned before. This is also supported in Alpha's constant mention of being the opposite from Mademba constantly, physically, and also in Alpha's having made love, but Mademba dying a virgin. This is one of the aspects as well. There's surely a bit more that I could dive into here with more evidence to support this idea, but I think plenty of this is a representation of the brutality and ugliness of war, that people can reach a breaking point and become the monster they are meant to destroy. The book also frequently, within the first half of it, discusses the idea of rage and anger not being allowed to be shown off the battlefield, I suppose. Pain is allowed to be shown, but rage is not. And the fear the soldiers had for Alpha came because his inhuman brutality that he performed on the battlefield was not left on the battlefield. Alpha is a character who experiences significant trauma, who gives into the call of inhumanity, and whose personality splits to make way for the brother who died next to him, brought on in part by guilt for not having given Mademba the death he wanted. So Alpha became Mademba in a sort of, it's a simultaneously symbolic and also literal sense. He takes on Mademba's personality within himself as a mental disorder, and not necessarily literally becomes Mademba, right? And this part, again, goes back into that idea with the minor trigger warning. Alpha becomes Mademba to give him the last experiences of life that he missed before his death, so that he could still be a man in death. Hence why you see the assault upon Mademoiselle Francois, the nurse, being seen in two separate chapters, one very clearly in Alpha's head, wondering why, or basically recounting what happened, how he got in and what he did, or very heavily implying what he did, and then the other chapter being from the point of view of Mademba, not knowing where he is, why he is where he is, and who the person is he is on, and other material there as well that, again, I'm not going to get super into, and I'm not going to say the word straight up because I don't want to get banned. But either way, yeah, this was part of the point that Alpha was kind of making with the dichotomy between them. He becomes Mademba to give him this last experience of life so that he could still be a man in death despite dying a boy because he was a virgin. So there's sort of the sexual aspect, the thematic undertone as well. Furthermore, I will also add that in terms of interpretations of this book, there are plenty of people that say this book is about, I want to bring this up because I don't want people to think that I'm just avoiding it. There are people that say this book is about race and colonialism as well, but I don't personally see it. There's not a whole lot to suggest that this was meant to be one of the main points of the book. There is a little bit there, I suppose, but most of it is so subtle that it clearly isn't meant to be the point of it. I just thought I'd mention it so that people didn't think I'm missing part of the book, because I took those aspects into consideration and don't really see too much to analyze with them. It's generally just non-existent in the subtext of the book. But the ideas on display with the fracturing of the human psyche and the subsequent mental health conditions is very cool. But yeah, those are essentially my ideas and my interpretations of the story in light of the last few chapters that just get so crazy so quickly. Let me know in the comments below what you think of my interpretations, or if you have a different interpretation, and basically spell that out for me. Let me know what you think the book is about, what it is doing, especially with the end, and why you think that way, so that I can maybe have a little bit more ideas going forward. There's not many videos specifically focusing on this aspect of the book that I've seen, like I said, so I want to know what others think, since you kind of have to go searching and find certain internet forums like on Reddit or wherever to get some sort of idea what some other people are thinking. So if you have any ideas that differ from mine, or especially if they're somewhat similar to mine, let me know. I would greatly appreciate that. But thank you for checking out this very long video. If you did, I hope I made some sort of sense, and if you were confused, I hope that my explanation kind of makes a little bit of sense, that maybe there's a little bit there that you see, or that you understand, or you see why I put it that way. If so, again, that's awesome, and if not, let me know what you think instead. I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching.